Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Google, Facebook, they've agreed to team up against a possible antitrust action, according to the draft of a lawsuit, which has now been filed. You've probably heard something about this, in addition to the United States accusing Google of illegally protecting a monopoly. There's actually two different lawsuits that we have to take a look at. A group of 11 states attorneys general joined with the Justice Department in filing a lawsuit in October. 3 additional states, including California, have since moved to join that lawsuit. And then a separate group of 35 states, led by Colorado and Nebraska, filed broader but related antitrust claims against Google in a new lawsuit that has also been assigned to the same judge. What's going on here? How important is it to you, the everyday person? Are Facebook and Google doing something that hurts you, the consumer, the end user? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on tech and why it matters to you without our resident expert.
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, I'm going to play the role of a prognosticator today, and I'm going to prognosticate some issues here on the technology of the world and monopolies in general. And I feel like I'm pretty qualified to talk about monopolies. And when you boil it all down, this Google and all this stuff, Facebook stuff is all about monopolies. So I can handle monopolies. So I think I will bring to the table some good prognostication today on this topic. So the word of the day is prognosticate, prognosticate. It is a transitive verb, which means it can take an object. It means to foretell or to predict, or to indicate beforehand.
Lance, is it fair? Do we get to count word of the day mentions before announcing what the word of the day is? That sounds like a rigging of the system here. Are you in cahoots with Google and Facebook?
I'm in cahoots with me that I think I've won the last 12 words of the day in a row after you won the first 2 by keeping track and not telling us that we were keeping score. And I think I'm undefeated since I know the rules.
Well, see, and if we know the rules of the game, then we know that I could just direct Bradley to remove every time that you say the word, so that as far as the listeners are concerned.
When Bradley's on the recorder, I never know until I listen to the show what I actually said.
Well, and see, that's kind of the interesting thing with our setup today, Lance, is what's going on with Google and Facebook. Well, to break it down in hopefully real simple terms that don't unfairly diminish the lawsuits or Google or Facebook's defense.
So really though, this is all about whether or not, because it's Google as a search engine, right? And Google and Facebook are accused by the federal government and now by some states also joining the lawsuits that they are in cahoots to limit what consumers have the availability to do when they go searching for answers. Is that, in a nutshell, kind of what's going on here? I mean, that was my understanding reading through everything.
That's what I would say one of the lawsuits more specifically focuses on, while the other one basically accuses Google of exercising its monopolistic power over search engines. And I think it's important, and basically what they're saying there is this unfairly hurts consumers because Google gets to decide, right, what is going to be shown most highly in its results. And there's been a lot of documented instances of, things that Google prefers being shown higher while things Google does not being shown lower, regardless of whether or not it's necessarily, preference by the consumer. And so what all this means, Google and Facebook, though, in fairness, and it should be noted, both completely deny all of the claims that have been made in the lawsuits and say that nothing they have done is unfair. And in fact, they claim that what they're doing actually benefits consumers and doesn't hurt them. Google specifically, Lance, came forward and said, look, people use Google not because they have to, but because they want to. And, there are alternative options. It's not our fault that people don't use those alternative options.
Spoken like a true monopolistic power. I'm not prognosticating here, but because I read it in the article, but didn't it say that they're worth over $1 trillion? So of course you're going to say that so that you can keep making money. But one of the other things I read in a couple of the articles, that in documents collected by the states and the U.S. government, Google and Facebook kind of preordained this. They said, okay, when we get sued for being, a monopoly, here's what we're going to do. To me, that kind of tells you right there, they anticipated this action. They knew what they were doing was, if not jumping over the line hardcore, was really skirting the law.
They felt that there was a high probability that somebody might want to accuse them of going over the line, right? I mean, you could say that doing this, you could look at it a couple different ways. One way would be to say, well, the very fact that they have an agreement that says that if they ever got, attacked about this, that they would work together to defend it is proof that they're guilty, because why would you do that if you didn't? The other side of that could be they knew that the evil federal government that stifles business would try to come after them and hurt them for something that isn't wrong, but they wanted to be prepared so that their business wouldn't be interrupted. And to understand why did they team up in the first place? I mean, because again, to your point, Lance, Google's a search engine, right? Among many other things, just to be clear. But Facebook more specifically is a social network. What they are both is an ad exchange. What do we mean by that? Well, you're probably familiar with the idea that that businesses can advertise on Google, right? In the most simple terms, a business can pay money to Google to be shown higher or at the top of search results and listed as an ad. I mean, it's labeled as an ad, but it could be the first thing in search results or higher up in search results for competitive markets. Of course, when you advertise with Google, you can also advertise on their video sharing platform, right? YouTube, which arguably is definitely a social media all its own. So when you really start to dig into it, and then you look at Facebook and you can pay to show up in people's news feeds, right? To promote your business, to promote your video, whatever, all of a sudden, are they different? Sure. Are they totally different? Not at all. And the way they make money is very much the same, which is all based on the data they can collect and how they can sell that via advertising to make money. That's in many ways, that's what they both heavily rely on to make a big chunk of change.
People might say, well, I don't care because it's free to me, so it doesn't matter. But it's not free because the reason it is free, but the reason it's free is because they're selling ads, right?
Well, is it free, Lance? Because isn't part of the agreement that user agreement that you sign saying that it's okay for them to make money off of your data? I mean, I know that we all think of these things as free, right? Going on Google, using Facebook, those are free, right? We don't pay anything for that. Well, you do pay. You pay in your data. All the information about you is what you're paying. It isn't free. You just don't have to outlay money, but you're still trading something. And that's, I think, super important to understand. It is not a free service in terms of nothing is expected of you. No, what's expected of you is to spend as much time as possible on this site so that we can gather as much data as possible and so that we can serve you as many ads as possible, which is how we make money.
And we plug it into the algorithm, which will give you the ads that you're going to use to buy products, which in turn, then we can charge more money to the companies from which you are purchasing things. Sure. And people don't realize it or don't care because it makes life better for them, or so they think. Right? Because I agree with you. I mean, and I'm glad you took my opening and ran with that and made that clear to people, because I think so many people do think, well, if free, it doesn't cost me anything. Well, but is it costing you something that's costs you a whole lot more than money does? I mean, like you said, all your information about you and what you purchase and where you go and how you travel and all of that stuff is being stored somewhere and being used by somebody so that they can make money off of all of that information. Correct?
Right. That's absolutely right, Lance.
I mean, you're losing your freedom and your individuality and your personality. I mean, you're not losing it, but somebody's gaining money off of all of that you do on a daily basis.
That's right. And we've got a lot more to talk about because Lance raised a fundamental question there, which is what we're going to discuss coming up. And it's that idea of, does it really benefit you? Because at the end of the day, that's the question we have to ask, right? It's not evil for a company to make money, especially if they're providing you something that doesn't monetarily cost you. Obviously, they got to make a living. So at the end of the day, is it the best thing for the consumer? That's part of what we want to examine. We are also encouraging people. You've listened to this first segment. You have comments or questions, you can email podcast@thestateofus.org. We mentioned our website, right? thestateofus.org. Well, we want your input. If you have a comment, a question, you email it to podcast@thestateofus.org. Does what Google and Facebook are doing ultimately benefit the consumer? Does it benefit you at home? Well, that's what we still have to answer. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The final version of the lawsuit, one of these lawsuits, did not make public details about the deal's value, referring to the deal between Google and Facebook. The draft states that starting in the deal's fourth year, Facebook is locked into spending a minimum of $500 million annually in Google-run ad auctions. Facebook is to win a fixed percent of those auctions, the draft version says. According to the draft version, an internal Facebook document describes the deal as, quote, relatively cheap when compared with direct competition, while a Google presentation said if the company couldn't, quote, avoid competing with Facebook, it would collaborate to, quote, build a moat. The redacted lawsuit filed last week doesn't include those quotes.
What's the issue? I mean, they're a monopoly. Okay. I mean, your question is, do we care? And is it benefiting us in any way? And blah, blah, blah. But I mean, daggone, you just read it right there. And my understanding of what a monopoly is, that they've clearly jumped the broom and they're practicing, a monopoly and have created one. And according to our laws here in the United States, that's not good.
In the third segment of today's show, we have the opportunity to share with you something that came in over the weekend to one of our most recent episodes that we thought it showed somebody who had clearly listened to the entire episode, which is why we think it deserves a little time in the third segment to try to respond to some of what was asked.
You don't type out the word at. It's that little sign above the number 2, right, on your keyboard. You have to hit the shift thing.
Yeah. Well, it was important that we say that, Lance, because Bradley wouldn't know that. He's not very good with.
Yeah. Bradley may know tech, but he doesn't know how to go from page 2 of a newspaper to page 13 to finish reading the article.
This is true. So
we all have our skill sets, and we don't make fun of each other here on State of Us or anybody else, any of the listening audience. We all have our different skill sets, and we do the best to improve in those areas where we are lacking.
Just for folks to keep in mind, that is not an exaggeration what Lance just said. He was not hyperbolizing there. He was being quite honest. We handed Bradley early on in his tenure at TruChat a newspaper to read an article. And I said, "Did you finish reading the whole thing?" Well, he said, "It just cut off at the end. I don't know how to get to the rest of it." So that was pretty good. But and right at the end it tells you, of course, what page to go to, but couldn't find A5 or whatever it was on. So, but the point, Lance, here is, and this is the question that we left off the last segment with, that I think this is where I struggle, because Google's point, people use Google because they want to, not because they have to. That's what Google says. Here's the thing. Do I think that Google and Facebook are doing something shady, and working behind the scenes to benefit each other? Because look, they looked at each other and they said, we're taking business from each other, right? I mean, that's just the reality. That's the nature of what's happening. We both run ad exchanges. There's only so many ad dollars. People have to make decisions about where to spend it. At the end of the day, that's the reality. So they said, if we can't beat the other one, then let's work with them to build a moat. But the question that Google raises, I think, is a fair one. Do people use Google because they have to or because they want to? This web browser that I installed, the default search engine is not Google. It's Microsoft Bing, right? Which is the second largest search engine. And just to put in perspective for people, Google consumes like over 80% of all searches. But I went in and changed the default search from Bing to Google. I made that choice.
How many people even know how to do that? I mean, I could probably mess around for an hour or so and figure out how to do that, or I would call you and you'd have me do it in 5 seconds, or I'd turn my screen over to you and you would do it for me. But I mean, how many people are consciously choosing that? See, I think that's a falsehood. Yes, it's easy to defend and say that, but the bottom line is everything you said, and I'm thinking back to my days in the classroom when we taught business and ethics and morals and monopolies, that everything you just said screams monopoly. And the bottom line is we have a fundamental, or used to have a fundamental feeling here in the United States that monopolies are not good for capitalism and they are not good for consumers, because what we benefit from as a consumer is competition. And what monopolies try to do by definition is get rid of competition. And so everything that you've read and said, and that I've read in these articles, is these two companies are practicing a monopoly. And historically in our country, that's not a good thing for the future economically and for business in the United States when companies are allowed to practice monopolies.
Bradley, our producer folks, the wise, collegiate Bradley, and member of Gen Z. If you open up a device and you go to do a search, do you care if it defaultly goes through something other than Google? Does it register to you? And do you do something then to go through Google? Maybe you don't set it as the default, but you go to google.com and then do the search because you don't want to use Bing or I'd be hard pressed. Here's that monopoly claim to name many others. And I'm pretty familiar with tech. DuckDuckGo would be another one, or Yahoo.
Does Yahoo still exist?
See, folks, case in point. Does Yahoo still exist? Yeah, it does.
There was a Networks or something, or Net something that maybe still is in existence. I mean, I grew up using Yahoo, and then the school we used Bing for a little while. So, I mean, I'm familiar with those items, but anyway, back to Bradley. Let's get the answer from the all-knowing one.
So returning to Bradley, Lance, right? Since we kind of hijacked the answer there. I guess what I'm curious to know, Bradley, is what do you think about that? Do you choose to use Google, or is it an afterthought? I mean, do you care what search engine you're using? Do you change the default? For example, if you open something and it's not set to Google, do you go to Google?
Whenever I open a search engine, it's typically always powered by Google. But if it's not powered by Google, I would go and change it. Okay.
So you would notice.
Yeah.
And it would bother you.
This is like very honest. If I saw a Bing logo next to my search bar, I might, get a little crawl up my spine or something.
And if you saw anything other than Bing, you'd probably freak out and think you were on the dark web or something, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Bing would be uncomfortable, but anything else would be freaky. It'd be like, oh, I don't know what I'm on here. And this is an important point, because do people choose to use Google? Yes. Do they know that they're making that choice? I think that's a little more complicated. And do they really have another choice? Yeah, technically they do, right? I mean, yes, technically there are other search engines. There's other stuff out there. But at the end of the day, and this is, I think, a case in point with Bradley, why did Google become Bradley's point and choice? Well, it's what he knows, right? To his point, pretty much every web browser he's
because
opened.
They signed a deal with everybody else and said, here's your go-to. I mean, it's like a lot like we did with Microsoft back in the day and Bill Gates.
And it's in the schools, right, Lance?
Right. And this is,
I mean, everything you do is through Google Classroom, is it not?
well, in most schools it is, yes, because they've paid for the rights.
But
to
I mean,
do that.
you.
Oh, me, yes.
You as a teacher, your personal
where I
experience,
work,
your whole world
in the
is
school district
inside.
where I work, it is all Google and Google Classroom, and they turn in your paper this way, and they turn in their speeches and products and videos all through Google products because they have what are called Google Chromebooks, and they got those very cheaply from Google. So as we've talked about before in other episodes, then what Google has done has found a very cheap way to get customers for life.
And Bradley, to be clear, right? When you just recently left high school, you were using Google Classroom on a Google Chromebook, running Google Chrome OS.
Yeah, Chrome OS, Google Docs, Google Slides, Google Spreadsheets, and Google Classroom. Every single one. Yep, every product.
So what you're telling me, Lance, just to be, as blatantly obvious as we can with folks, is that Google gave you the computer that has the Google operating system on it that uses only the Google products, which are inside the Google Classroom ecosystem. And of course, therefore, the default search engine would be Google. So when Bradley leaves high school and his Chromebook goes away and he's on a new computer that's not a Google computer, right? Maybe it's a Microsoft product, or it's an Apple product, or it's a Dell, or who knows, right? But it's something else. Well, he feels a little antsy because, it's not. Right. Yeah. A little lost. And he opens up his web browser and, oh my God, Bing is there. What the heck is this? It's supposed to be Google. So did he really choose Google? Well, not really, because he was taught while he was in school to use Google.
For example, I got a Mac after high school, and when you open Safari, it's just by default powered by Google.
I mean, didn't Bill Gates back in the 90s have this same issue because they were putting on their computers, they were putting,
Internet Explorer.
Yeah, they were putting things on it, and they said, you can't do that anymore. And he's like, well, wait a minute, it's our product. We can put our software on there. And they said, well, no, you can't, because you're stopping people from going out and getting something else. And he goes, well, but there's stuff out there in the stores. They can go purchase it if they want and put it on there. And the government said no, because since you go ahead and put it on the device, people aren't going to go get it from somewhere else. And he's like, well, that's not my fault. And then I'm going back to my youth with Ma Bell, and all of you Gen Zers can look that one up. But there used to be one phone company. And if you made a phone call, you made it with Bell Telephone Company. There was no, AT&T, but there's no Verizon. There's no, what all those other ones that are out there that everybody has cell phones from. That came about because we broke up a monopoly. That's the best example that I can give to young people. Would we have cell phones as quickly and the variety and the prices and everything else that we have if the government hadn't broken up Bell Telephone Company?
We'll make it real for the Bradleys of the world, right? If you're like Bradley and you love Apple, right? You're fully committed. Apple for life, baby. That's what we're all about. You know who you have to thank for that? And not Steve Jobs. It ain't him. It's the United States federal government. Because if the United States federal government had not come after Microsoft for antitrust, violations, Microsoft would have squished Apple. There would be no Apple today. Apple was about to go bankrupt when Microsoft infused it with $100 million cash infusion in 1999, 2000, which of course you do that in today's dollars. It's what Apple needed to keep going. So let's just put it in perspective for people. That iPhone you love might not even be on planet Earth, might not have ever even been created or conceived.
If we didn't break up a monopoly.
Right. And so that's the point of the importance of this, is things like that. If you love your iPhone, think about the reality of you wouldn't even have your iPhone if we allowed monopolies to exist without any questioning of them. That's what we're going to keep talking about coming up is, do the monopolies hurt people? I think they have monopolies, but do they really hurt people? Well, it sounds like they do, but there is more to talk about. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are the State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
We've spent a lot of time talking about whether or not you have the choice to use Google or not. And I think that answer is a little bit complicated because, as we've talked about and as Lance left off with, is it brainwashing? Is that what's happening? And he used a relatively recent historic example of Microsoft, right? For those of you that were alive, you may remember that big antitrust lawsuit in the government, Bill Gates having to testify before Congress. And, basically what Microsoft was doing is, look, we control 90+% of the computer market. And when we ship Windows on PCs that our partners manufacture, we include an internet browser, right, called Internet Explorer. For those of you that are, I don't know, Bradley, did you ever use Internet Explorer? Is that too old?
I played computer games when I was in kindergarten on Internet Explorer, but my time for seriously using a computer has all been Google.
Okay. Yeah. It's always been Chrome.
Yeah.
Right?
Chrome. Yeah.
So, I remember, Lance, of course, that, my first computer, the only thing that came on it, right, for the only way that you could access the internet was with Internet Explorer. Now, you could use Internet Explorer, and of course, in the later days of Internet Explorer, it became a joke. The only reason that people use Internet Explorer is to download another web browser, right? The point of your historical example, I think, is well taken in that this idea was that Microsoft was shipping options and only letting you use that option, right? It's if you don't want to use Internet Explorer, you can go buy a different computer. And of course, the response was, what other computers? You control 90%, of all the computers that are shipped, you're the software on 90% of those computers. So the only other people that have any market share is Apple, and theirs is so tiny, and their machines so expensive relative to your personal computers, that is it really realistic to say that most people have that option? Google is in it very much engaging in, I'm sure there's a medical term for this or some scientific term, right? But brainwashing. For lack of our highfalutin term, behavioral training.
They're practicing monopolistic behavior.
On multiple levels, though. And that's the thing
right.
I want to highlight is these lawsuits just talk about the ad exchanges. But I have complained for years, Lance knows, that I think one of the greatest disservices the education system in the United States of America is doing is plugging in these exclusive-based systems to our children. And not just Google, because, by the way, that's not the only one that exists. There are schools that use Microsoft. There are schools that use Apple. But Google is present in almost all of those circumstances. Even the schools that are using Apple exclusively, they're not using Apple exclusively. They're using Apple as the hardware provider for the most part. And then they're still running through, Google Classrooms or Microsoft's version of Google Classroom.
Well, is this too simplistic, or this used to be the case 10, 15 years ago? And that is, you were using Apple products in a school, using a Mac, and then you'd go into the business world and you'd be using Microsoft. My
experience, Lance, was, and I think this is sort of similar to Bradley's, my experience was most of what we had at Urbana High School were Apple products. And when I went to college, Xavier University was a Microsoft-based, campus. Email was through Microsoft. You had the Microsoft Cloud, and you could use whatever computer you wanted. So I had lots of friends that brought the MacBook Air, of course, was, the computer of choice. I know it still is for many people, but that was what the original MacBook Air, and lots of my friends had the MacBook Air, and then they had downloaded the Microsoft suite onto the MacBook Air. So Google really wasn't, Google was maybe the search engine, but Google was not, there was no Google Classroom involved, no Google Docs like that. It wasn't even part of the equation. And now the transformation that's taken place, and I think this is what Bradley went through, is that Google's everything in the K through 12 setting, right? It's the computer, it's the software, it's the cloud computing, the search engine, it's all of it. It's everything. There is no Microsoft or Apple involvement at that level. And then you go to college, and I think at Ohio State, right, they are a Microsoft-based, your emails through Microsoft, all of your programs that you get for free are through Microsoft. So Bradley's living very much the same experience I had when I went to college. Bradley's got the hardware that is Apple with the software that is mostly Microsoft.
Ohio State is kind of odd because they provide Apple hardware, but we use Microsoft software for everything. And also another thing I wanted to add about the Google ecosystem, I suppose, would be everything's run through a browser, right? So you're not downloading any apps. And that's another big thing when you shift from like using a Chromebook to a real computer. Like a lot of my friends who I had to work with this past semester, they didn't know how to download things. Like they wanted to work everything in a browser, and like they didn't know how to share files and things like that. So that was another sort of hurdle that had to be jumped because everyone's so used to using the Google Chromebooks in high school.
A large portion of consumers, long term, the future is what we would refer to as cloud computing, which is very much what Google is relying on there. They're basically saying, probably 90% of what most people do most of the time does not require great computing power locally present. As long as you can connect to the internet, we can basically give you a connection with a server or with a computer someplace else that has greater power that multiple people use. So, in many ways, that's very forward looking. At the same time, the future's not there yet. And in many companies where you work, you need to know the basics of how to save files on a computer or how to download and use programs that are on the computer. The internet's great when it's working, right? But that's the whole side of if you're offline with a Chromebook, you're pretty much dead in the water. Yeah, they've introduced some, a few things that you can do when you're not online, but it's a pretty abysmal experience. There's not much to be done. And of course, internet reliability, all that continues to improve. But I do think it's an important point that Bradley brings up of we are doing that disservice that I've talked about in education by exposing children to only one ecosystem. They ought to be using Google. They ought to be using Microsoft. They ought to be using Apple. I understand that's a lot harder for if we have IT admins out there, right? That is complicated when you're across ecosystems because there's more to manage and deal with. But we want to give people a choice. We have to make sure that when they're young, they're being shown that there are choices. It's that whole you can't ask people to know what they don't know. And if Bradley's never used Bing except to go to Google, he's going to have that repulsion, right? That's going to be the reaction. I remember in one of my classes, Lance, where we had to use, it was actually part of the assignment. We had to search through multiple search engines for the same thing. We had to do that to get our research because different search engines gave you different results.
I will just tell you, I'm so old. I remember having to train students how to ask the proper questions and type in the proper verbiage to get what they wanted. I was back there at the very beginning of all of that in school. So, we had places like Ask Jeeves and different things, and you had to teach students how to use the internet to find what they wanted. So, yeah, people they type stuff in and they don't even sometimes know what they're getting. And we've missed out in, as you said, in the education system on that aspect of teaching, that we just throw the device in their hands and say, go for it. And then they learn how to use that device, but they're not technologically savvy at all. They can only do what's on that device. And that does them a total disservice. And they don't even know necessarily how to work that device because they've got a phone. And so they only know how to work their phone. So then you give them a secondary device that's not their phone. And they're like, I don't know how to do anything on this. I can do this on my phone, but I don't know how to do it on this device. And that's a real part that we're missing here. And, I just want everybody to know it's been really hard to sit here and listen to you talk about Apple and squishing the competition because I'm in day 3 of a juice and it's just really taken me. It's like really, you got to bring up Apple and squishing it. And,
you got it squishing.
Yeah. But I totally agree with you. And you've brought that up many times on many different episodes, the disservice we're doing to young people in not training them in different programming and different devices.
People have to understand tech literacy. We think we live in an age of greater technological advancement than we've ever seen in any previous era. And that's true. At the same time, we also live more tech illiterate, arguably, than we've ever been, because that's how the companies that make the devices want it to be. That's what we're missing. And that's exactly what's at the heart of this whole conversation today, is that's what Google and Facebook want. They want Bradley to have this, gut disgust when anything other than Google comes up as the search engine. And I'm not being dramatic. That's what most people feel, they feel it inside. It's like, this won't do. I can't use that. That's just
because it allows those companies to make more money.
Exactly.
And that's what drives their business.
And we do want to hear from you. If you have a question, or comment, you can email podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. Send us an email. We want to hear your thoughts. We have one to share with folks today. Dylan sent in the following in regards to our episode on the death of American politics. By the way, if you haven't heard that, you should definitely check it out. He says, I enjoyed today's podcast and I have some questions. 1, do you think a new political party could be successful in today's politics? And if so, what do you think that would look like? And what would be some major challenges they would face? He also mentioned that he appreciates how we brought up the founding fathers and their actions despite knowing the consequences. So with that, how would modern patriots be able to replicate their success? Would it be possible within the confines of our current constitution and political system, or would something new have to be drafted from the foundation of their earlier beliefs? Lance, there's a lot of questions here. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on it, but my quick reaction to this is I appreciate what he's saying. I'm not sure, is a new political party possible? Absolutely. You can go start one right now. But to his point, I think the thing that fixes stuff is for people to be less tied to parties and more tied to independent thought. That's where I think having more independence, which is not a political party, that would be more beneficial and might bring about the type of change that he's hoping for rather than just a new party. Although I do think if we added a few parties, that could make a difference too.
Well, the historical perspective is that the current Republican Party was started as a third party. So it was not one of the two major political parties back in the 1830s and 40s. And it kind of amalgamated from smaller parties that joined together and finished second in an election and became the second political party behind the Democrats. So is it possible? Yes, it's possible. You need to get your ideas and you need to float those ideas out there and start slowly gaining people. And the thing is, it just won't happen quickly.
We want to get your feedback, your comments, because that's part of what we're doing here, Lance, right? I mean, that's part of the idea, the mission that we're all about at True Chat, the company that's responsible for the State of Us. What's this greater purpose that we're working toward?
Well, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And if you're talking to your friends and family and you're talking about the show and they're interested and they say, well, where can we listen to this? And you tell them you can find the State of Us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is both a podcast and a syndicated radio program. You can get new episodes of the podcast Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern Time. And the syndicated radio version is released on the weekends in select talk markets. So check your local talk station, see if they carry the State of Us. If they don't, call them up, tell them they should. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Thanks to our recording and editing producer for today, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.